Okay, hello everyone. We're gonna go ahead and start streaming now, so hopefully this is working. But it is 6:10, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming today. Today we're gonna be talking about something that's pretty important to using Figma. This is a pretty, I think, difficult concept to grasp immediately, but it's something that we hope to see you work on throughout the whole semester. And so today we're going to be talking about specifically components and composition. So we'll go ahead and start. Hello to everyone coming in now, no worries. The kind of format of how today's going to go, we have a demo in the middle, so we do encourage you to go ahead and duplicate this file. Here, the link is right here. It is bit.ly/Figma Decal -lec3 LEC3. That link is going to be on our Figma community page as well, at figma.com/@Figma Decal. You can always access it through there. For the attendance link today, it's also right here at bit.ly/FD-Sp22-lec3. But today we're going to be talking about components, a couple of additional useful tools, some of which you might have already run into, grids and guides, constraints, and then we'll be talking a little bit about composition and spacing, which are going to be really critical for if you're doing any kind of app development, mobile development, web development, that sort of thing, and looking at a couple of examples of kind of built-out design systems that you can draw inspiration from. We'll also be talking about ideation and wireframing. All right. So again, the links are right here if you didn't get a chance to see them. For those of you who are watching on stream as well, you can access that lecture file. And if you're not an enrolled student, you will not need the attendance form. And also, thank you for bearing with us last week for those of you on stream. I know that we didn't get to actually stream it live last week, but all of our videos are live on YouTube for lectures 1 and 2 as well. And so to anyone in the class, if you ever need to reference anything, everything is on YouTube as well. Awesome. So components. This is basically a kind of reusable element system throughout your design. You can think of it kind of like a sticker sheet or like a Lego building block. It's something that you're going to be able to use over and over again to really streamline your design processes. So again, reusability is kind of the key word here when you think about components. The idea is that you can have, one button that you can then design, and then you can use it everywhere else in the app. You make one toggle. You have all these kind of name fields or kind of text input fields. The idea is that, you always want those to look the same across whatever it is that you're building. You don't want the confirmation button to be one size and one screen, and then another size, another screen, another color and different screen. That's going to be really confusing to the users. There's going to be a set of cognitive dissonance if you do have all of these different modifications throughout your product. You can make a component out of literally anything in Figma, any kind of object, any set of objects, any group of objects, shapes, icons, images, text, so on and so forth. And you're going to be kind of building these out. Mostly you'll be using shapes and text for a lot of the components that you might be making. These are also good for kind of grouping things together into categories and maintaining consistency across your entire project. You're going to see this icon a couple of times throughout. It's this kind of fancy diamond looking thing. Anytime you see a diamond in Figma, it's referring to components, and we'll talk about in a little bit that there's two kinds of components that you'll be looking out for. So how do these work? There are, again, two types. Well, first, we'll think about this main component. The main component is like the parent. It's like the origin, it's the source, it's like the single point of truth. So the main component defines the properties. Some of these include like the size, the shape, the colors, the location, the text boxes, all of these different details of any particular element. The main component is in control of all of that. In order to make something into a main component, like say you've made this little icon with a happy face and the word happy, and you want to have this as let's say a mood tracker. You want to have one of these on every single day. So I've made the happy component. I put it in a frame or I put it in a group or something, and I make it a component by clicking on an icon in the middle of the top bar, which you might have seen show up a couple times. I can show you really quickly right here. When I select any object, you're going to see that this top bar changes. Originally it shows you the name of the file, but once I click it, you see the create component icon. This is Control-Alt-K or Command-Alt-K as well. So if you click this, it'll turn whatever you have selected into a main component. Now later, I talked about this idea of a sticker sheet, or this idea of reusability. Once I have that main component, I can make copies of it, and these are called instances. If you're familiar with any kind of programming, you might have heard of objects, instances, that kind of thing. It's the same idea. It's a copy, it's a child, it's connected to that main component. And the special thing about components is that if you edit the main component, those edits are reflected in every instance. So if I make a button and I have an app and it has 2,000 buttons and I've used them everywhere in the file, I've been working on this for weeks and weeks, and then, it's like halfway into this project we decide to change the font of the button, well, I have to go back and change every single button I've made. But if I just have the main component and all of its instances, if I just change the font in the main component, it will be reflected in every instance. So you can see how this is going to be coming in handy if you're working on an app, you're working on something that you're reusing a lot of elements. It means that you can make one change that's reflected everywhere. You can also manually change some of the properties of an instance. Like say in this example, I have a happy here and I have a sad here. So these main components, I have happy, sad, and surprised. But you see here that I have a nervous. This is an example of an override where I have taken an instance of the sad mood component, but I want the text to say something else, so I've changed one part of it. Changing one part means that all of the other details are still linked to it. So for example, the spacing is still the same. The face is still the same. The colors are still the same. If I change them here, they'll still be reflected. But because I want that text to be different, that's okay. I can change it in just that instance. This is also pretty similar to programming if you're familiar with that, but we'll kind of see how this manifests later on as well. But just keep in mind this idea of main and instances, those two types of components. You can find those components in the Assets panel. We've briefly mentioned this before. The kind of left sidebar has an extra panel that we haven't really talked about before because it's about components. So normally you're going to be set on this layers panel on the left sidebar, but if you click into Assets, you'll get to see all of the components that you use in the file. So there's this concept of libraries in Figma, which you probably won't touch on too many times. But if you think about working in a big company, like say I work at Google, and I need to use the same kind of thing in every single one of the Google apps. I want to be consistently using the same fonts, the same kind of pieces of UI, then I can access a library that maybe somebody else on my team has made. Somebody who's been working at Google for a while, they've already made a library that I can borrow things from. And so in this case, we have a library called Slide Deck Template that exists in a completely separate file, but it's within the same workspace. And because it's in the same workspace, I can turn it on, I can access it, and then I can drag out what's basically all of these slide deck templates, as you can guess. So this is an example of one of them. Once I drag that in here, you see that it has this kind of purple outline. Purple means components in Figma. So anytime you see purple inside of Figma design, it's going to be referring to a component, whether it's a main component, an instance, and this is always going to be distinct from normal objects that are always framed in blue. So if you click on something and it's purple, it's a component of some kind. As you can see here also, you can access just the things that I've used in this file. So an example of one kind of component that we use. If you've noticed, the bottom right-hand side of most slides has this kind of watermark that says Figma Decal Spring22. We have to change that every semester. So what we did is put a main component in the first slide or just somewhere else in the file, and then we have an instance of that watermark in every single slide. And so when it changes to the next semester, we just change that one component and it reflects in every single other slide. So this is kind of an example of when you might need to use components really easily. But looking at this assets panel, you can look at them in a list view or in a grid view, whatever works the best for you. And you can see everything that's local. Local means something that has been created within this file versus the idea of libraries that I mentioned earlier, something that exists in a separate file that I'm borrowing from. You can also access a version of this panel by pressing Shift-I. It is a lot more convenient in my opinion. So if I press Shift-I, it'll pull up this modal. I can drag it around, move it out of the way. But this is a little bit more flexible. It's also a pretty recent update to Figma. You can filter through things like local components. You can look at use in this file. You can access different kinds of things. And this idea is just to if you're building an app, you're probably going to be using components quite a lot, probably quite more often than you're going to be used to doing right now. And being able to just drag this around in a modal form is a lot easier because I can still see all of these layers, I can still see all these objects I have on the screen, but I can just add them here whenever I need them. So just keep in mind, Assets Panel and Shift-I are going to be the way that you access existing components. Now, this idea of components kind of is abstract in how you're actually going to be utilizing them, and this is kind of two main ways that you can think about it, conceptualize it. You're probably going to be doing a little bit of both. But the first is this idea of creating a bunch of different main components that reflect different cases. So one example here is I have a progress bar, and I know that I'm going to be using this progress bar on, say, every single screen. It's going to be either at not started, in progress, submitted, or results. It's going to be one of those 4 states. It's never going to be like in between them. And so this is a case where I might want to make 4 versions of that one component and then use those specific 4 versions later on. So you see in these kind of 2 screens, they've got the same basic content, but the component is swapped, and it shows you kind of the stage of the process that you're in. So another example of something where you might have a lot of versions of a similar component, like things that are in the same family, are icons. So I might have, there's like tons of articles from people who do design systems on like the right way to do icons in your design system. We don't have to worry about that right now. But I would want a different component for every single icon I have. So let's say that I have, let's say that I work at Figma and I have an icon for the cursor, I have an icon for the frame, I have an icon for the rectangle, for the pen, for the text, for the hand. I want those all to exist separately instead of using that concept of overrides we mentioned before. So that anytime I'm building something else, I need like this hand icon all of a sudden, I can go and grab it from that kind of sticker sheet of components later on. Now the opposite of this, or kind of the other way to conceptualize components, is using like a template. Something that has like filler text or kind of filler information, and then implementing overrides. So an example where you might use this is like these cards. So this is an example of a template card that just says October 10th, very, very long organization name that spans 2 lines. And in the actual app, all of these would actually be organization names, but I wouldn't want to make one component for every single organization. That again defeats the entire point of having the components. And so I have this sticker sheet with a default, something like filler text or just name of organization. When I actually implement them in the app, I can go through them and say, this one is actually called Girls Who Code, it's October 14th. This one's actually called Emerald Isle Immigration Center of New York. And I can use those overrides and leverage the kind of templatization in a way that's helpful. So some examples of things that might be approached as like a template that you'll use overrides for are cards, any kind of button where the text might change later on, text inputs, and that sort of thing. Okay, I know that was kind of confusing. Are there any questions about that concept of these like 2 kind of ways to use components?
Can we see a demo later?
Yeah, we can see a demo later for sure. I was actually pulling these up. I'll be talking about these a little bit more later. But on Figma Community, which is kind of where you're grabbing your homeworks from right now, you can actually search for other things, and I would highly recommend these 2 files. The first is the Material 2 design kit. Material design is like the whole design system that all of the Google products use. So if you have an Android, you might be familiar with what these things look like. And then there's also a really, really helpful iOS 15 UI kit made by someone else as well that you can reference that uses a lot of the things in iOS. So one example of this like example 2, where you have a template of something, is like the messaging bubbles. So if I go here, and let's see if I can navigate this because this file is enormous. Basically, they have all of the messaging or conversation iMessage bubbles, but with just like random like placeholder text, like, hey, let's get pizza tonight, I think is the example that they use. And obviously, not every single text that you make in your app is going to say, let's get lunch, how about pizza emoji. I don't actually want every single text to say this, but I also don't want to write every single possible text I'm going to be using in my app and make those all separate components. So if I'm building something out and say I need to make the screen for texting, I would use one of these. I would drag one out. Okay, this file is really big, so it might actually not load very well, but we'll be seeing this later. And I would just like change the text to say whatever it is that I need it to say. But an example where I might want multiple versions of the same component kind of used together, which we'll also kind of talk about this idea of variance in just a minute, is, I found one earlier, like this. So there's a couple of different versions of these alerts that you see on iPhones. One has 1 action, one has 2 actions, one has 2 actions on top of each other, one has 3 on top of each other. And this is a case where I want to have different versions of the same thing already pre-built that I can then change later. At the same time, I would be changing the word action and the word title here and the word here's an alert description. So there's pieces of this kind of sense of components where you have to understand where you might use overrides and where you might need to make like a whole new object. Does that make any sense? We'll kind of walk through this a little bit more later in the demo as well. I think it'll make a little more sense when we actually try it out. So a couple more examples here that are a little bit more different. there's a lot of ways that you can use components. A lot of the stuff that I've said so far kind of tailors it to this UI UX or to apps or web design, but you can also use them in fun ways. One of my favorite files to talk about on Figma community is that somebody made the board game Settlers of Catan in Figma entirely, so that you can play it with your friends remotely. Everything that you need for the game is inside that one file. And the way that they've approached using all of these different houses and all of these different roads is through components. And because these are components, if they were, say, designing it, and later on they were like, I need to change the color of the red, I don't like it anymore, they could go ahead and just change it in that one component. Or if they wanted to change the shape of the house, they could change the one component and it would be reflected in every single other one in the game, which there would be dozens and dozens of. It also means that they could just make one and then people could drag out copies of it instead of having to make like 10 individual objects and that's all you're left with. This is an example of something that I guess is a little bit more complicated, but they have all these like text boxes in this like Figma anniversary bingo thing that they made a couple years ago, where you could change, the pieces of text, but these are all very uniform. All of the bingo squares are the same size. They all have the same text. They all have the same properties, besides just the actual words that are written there. Something that is a little bit more familiar maybe is different kinds of buttons. So variants, which we'll talk about in just a second, are going to express this idea of like, hey, why are there 12 buttons here instead of just one kind? Well, all those buttons are related, and sometimes you need multiple versions of one thing. This is more stuff from the Catan board game, and then this is also something that we'll be diving into later, but this like idea of an avatar maker. If you ever had a Nintendo Wii, the Mii Maker is a great example of using different kinds of components, and especially different kinds of variants, where you have that base template and then all these kind of sticker sheet pieces that you can drag onto the Mii or like you can access in order to add like different versions of the same thing, basically, which leads us really nicely into this concept of variants. So variants are a way of grouping components with similar purposes that have minor differences. So in this example, we've got 16 versions of button. So all of these are button. All of these are going to be used in some way as a button, but they have different properties. So this is a case where, say, anytime that I see a button on the screen, by default it'll look like this color. If I'm hovering over it, it'll get lighter. You'll see this a lot as a pattern in a lot of UI, where like even these tabs up here, if I hover over it, the text becomes brighter and the tab itself becomes different, and you'll see that an X button actually appears. This is like the hover state versus the default state. And then if I select it, it actually changes just a little bit more as well. You see when I'm clicking on it, the X here actually gets brighter as well, and then when I'm not hovering on it, the X disappears. So there's actually, I think, 4 different states of just this one tab, which gives you an idea of why you might need kind of this whole row, this first row, primary, with default, hover, focus, and disabled. Now another case, maybe there's 2 properties that I need to deal with here, and you see it right here. This is a version of the tab that has an icon versus a version of the tab that doesn't have it. And this actually does have all of the same ideas. It has like this hover, it has this focus state, it has a default state and probably a disabled state as well, but it also has an icon. And so for that reason, we'd have to make a second axis of properties. So this is an example of like primary with icon. Let's say Figma had a light mode. If it had a light mode, then it'd have to have an inverted version of all of these tabs with a white background and black text, and that would be kind of this idea of the secondary here. And so all of those would still be tabs, the same way that all of these are still buttons. All of them are very much related, but by using variants, we can keep them really cleanly organized. And you'll see that a lot of this is like, you can get away with not doing any of this, but doing this is you're gonna thank yourself later actually for actually implementing this design system, making things really clean. And especially if you're working with anybody else, whether you're working with other designers, if you're working with developers, if you're working with PMs or external team members, having a clean design system and having a clean file that's easy to understand is really critical to making your work stream a lot more efficient. So having variants, which we'll talk about how to actually make these, lets you switch between those versions really quickly in a way that you'll see in just a minute. So in order to make them, a lot of the time as you design, this is a question that comes up a lot, is like, when do I start making components? The answer is usually that you'll be making something and then realize that you're using it over and over again. That's when it's time to make a component. And if you're seeing yourself doing a similar thing as this, where you're using something a lot, but you're making different versions of it, that's probably a time to make a variant. And so it's a very organic process, and I always have a little bit of trouble answering this question, because the reality isn't like I sit down for the day and I'm like, I'm going to make 30 components. Like, that's not really kind of the way that design process necessarily works. A lot of the time you make it out of necessity or because it's the thing that makes the sense to do. So here, if I want to make variants from components, you can do this kind of neat trick where you rename stuff and then you can combine them as variants. This is more relevant because when we were teaching this last year, they released variants like halfway into the semester and they hadn't existed before, and so they implemented this way to kind of go back and fix all of your old components. This slash naming scheme is something that a lot of people were doing already, where you'd have button slash default, button slash hover, and they would do these to just keep them organized. You can still do this, and then as you kind of build out your system, you might find like, hey, this seems like a good time to combine them as variants, in which case these are all just button with different properties. So this is button default, button hover, button focus, button disabled, but they exist under this kind of family or this kind of umbrella that's called just button. This idea of swapping as well, you'll see in this GIF here that if I put down one of them, there's an element that appears in the right sidebar that lets me change them really easily. This is really quite convenient because I don't have to go back into my sticker sheet. I don't have to go all the way back into a different page. I don't have to go locate it. I don't even have to go into that assets panel. I can just switch it really quickly from the sidebar. You can also adjust their properties very quickly, easily in the right sidebar, which we'll see again in the demo. With that, I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into this idea of how to make them. And if you are in the file, you can go ahead and go to the page called Demo Space. Apologies if there's some alignment issues with some of the text. I realized some of it got dragged before. But what we're going to do today is build this card and then duplicate it to make an instance. And then we're going to make a variant of it. So let's say that this is a card that is in some kind of weather app. You know, I'm tracking the weather for the week. I need to show all of these for each particular day. So just logistically, let's start by making this card. It has a gray rectangle. Let's go ahead and drag that out. Mine will be just a little bit different because I'm going to be eyeballing it. I made a rectangle with R. I'm going to use the eyedropper. That's I, the key I. And I'm going to drag this color right here. I'm going to round the corners of it. So if I go up to the top right, I see the corner radius. Let's make it like 5. I've rounded the corners just a little bit. I realize this is a little bit hard to see, so what I'm going to do is put this inside of a frame just so that it is a little bit easier to see. Now I see that this has 3 pieces of text. It says Berkeley, California, cloudy, and 56. I'm going to click on the piece of text so I grab all of its properties and then type out right here, Berkeley, CA. I want to put this here. I'm going to make it 8 pixels from each edge. And then I'm going to click here to grab the properties again, and then type cloudy. Now with cloudy, something that I'm going to think about right now is that it's right aligned. If I had this word be like super extra cloudy, I still want it to be aligned on the right. So I'm going to go ahead and make the text right aligned as well by clicking here. And I'm going to make the text a little bit lighter because it's not the primary information. If you're following along, let me know if I'm going too fast or if this is too slow or anything. Next, I'm going to grab the temperature right here, clicking on it again so I can copy the properties and typing 56. This is still, I want it to stay left aligned and I want it to be right here. I'm going to align it 4 down, so it's 8 from the bottom. And now I've got the basic components, or the basic pieces of this component. There are icons down here that you can grab because we haven't talked about the pen tool quite yet. So I'm going to drag out a copy of this with Alt or Option and pull it all the way over here. Let's align this right now as well. Move that over to be just about 8 from both sides. Make sure that this is aligned as well. Yeah, you just press Alt or Option while you have something selected. So if I press it now, whatever I'm hovering over, it'll tell me how far away it is. Oh, okay. Yeah. Nope, no problem. All right. So this is my component, this is my weather card. I'm going to select all of these, and then what I'm going to do is click here and say create components. You'll see here that there's 2 other options because I'm actually selecting 5 things. I select the rectangle, the 3 pieces of text, and the icon. If I said create multiple components, it's going to make all of those separately their own thing. So cloud, 56, cloudy, Berkeley, and rectangle. I don't want that. I just want the one single component as one piece, and so I'm doing that. And you see here that it's kind of collapsed everything into something called component 5. It's purple, it's got all of these things in it, and you see this fancy diamond icon again. So that is my first component. We can name it whether card/cloudy. And then now I want to make an instance of it. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this out. I do Control C and then Control D to make a copy of it, or Control V. Control D versus Control V. Control D will just duplicate it on top of wherever it was, or if you had been spacing stuff out evenly, it'll space it out for you automatically. Control V will just put it in the center of your screen. Okay, and so now I have an instance of it. And let me actually drag this out of the frame to show you something special. Main components always show the name on the top left corner, while instances do not. Main components are treated more closely as frames, while these are treated more like objects, and you'll see that their icons differ as well. The main component, let me see if I can make my UI bigger, there we go. The main component always has this kind of fancy looking diamond, while instances have a unfilled single diamond, so you can tell them apart in that way as well. And so let's demonstrate that idea of adopting properties. So if I change this here, if I change the text, you're going to see that it is reflected as well in the instance. And if I make another copy of the instance, no matter how many of these I have, did Control D just now for that, these are always going to reflect whatever it is that I have in the main. However, if I decide to override one of them, so I take the first one and I decide, hey, actually no, it's 79 degrees, that property is not going to be affected by the main anymore. The other two are still affected. The same goes for things like color. So if I take the card itself and I change it to be a darker color, this is not accessible, but we'll worry about that later. But if I change the color here, it's going to change the bottom two, but not the top one anymore. So we see here that this is going to mimic here. And so you kind of start to see, hopefully, how components might be useful and practically. If you have a case where, this particular example, you'll probably have a lot of the weather cards where the default text says this, but I need to change the location, I need to change the temperature, I need to change the weather. But if I need to change the icon to be bigger, I can go ahead and still do that in the future. It's not going to be an issue. I can just change the one particular component. So that's steps 1 and 2. Any questions about any of those things? Yep.
What if you wanted to override, for the cloud in one instance, you just wanted to override the color, but if you wanted to change the size of the main component, it won't change the size of the instance anymore?
Let's actually find that out. Honestly, that's a little bit shaky, so let's go ahead and change the color of this. If I change the size in the main, it still affects it. So I think Figma does its best to constrain those properties as closely as possible. But I will say one of the things that you can't do, that you can't override, is placement. So I can't move this text to be anywhere else. This is just because placement is not something that you would ordinarily want to ever change in one component. It's something that it is strictly constrained to follow the main component, because there's not really a good practical reason to be doing that. One example where we did run into a practical reason was the slide deck. So all of these slides, what we've actually done is taken those component sticker sheets, but you'll see that all of these are gray and they're blue and they don't have the purple outline. We actually detached all of the instances because we needed to change things like where the text goes exactly, and we wanted to just sorry, can you fix this? I don't know why this happened, but we wanted these to be like sticker sheets, but we needed to still change some of their properties. If you ever run into this case where you need to detach the instance, what you can do is take the instance that you're looking at, right click and say detach instance. It's also Control-Alt-B or Command-Option-B. And what you're going to see here is that it's going to turn into a frame. It's going to have the blue outline now. It's going to say card cloudy in the top left. And this is a frame that's no longer affected by any of the changes that I make here. So that's what you do if you need to detach an instance. I'm going to turn the lights on really quickly. Oh, great, they're on! Yay! Okay, sorry about that. But that's the idea of detaching an instance, if that makes sense. Any other questions about this before we go kind of to the next steps? Cool. So the next step here is to detach the instance like we just talked about. We want to edit it to be a different weather or city, and then we want to make that a second variant. This is one of many different ways to make a variant, and so I'm going to show that I'm going to show you this other way first. This demo is a little bit outdated, but if you look here, I'm going to take my main card cloudy. I'm going to change this back to see Berkeley CA. Don't worry about the other stuff that we've made before. I'm going to take this, and if you look here, there is an item called variants. If I click this, it's going to make an identical copy of this particular component, and then put me into this idea of like property one variant. And so what I'm going to do is change this to be I want to make this a rainy version. So I'm going to make this a rainy. This is set to default, or this is set to cloudy actually, because we named it card/cloudy. And then I have these two variants, these two versions of the same card. And right now they say the same thing. So I'm going to make this one say rainy. And I'm going to grab the icon from here, the rain icon, copy, and paste it here. Okay, and I've got rain. And so what I've just done is made a second version of the same component, and they're kind of surrounded by these purple dotted lines. So this purple line is basically explaining that these are a family, these are variants of the same thing, and they're all called card. This is called card cloudy, this is called card rainy, but they're both types of cards. Fundamentally, when you're actually using this, you're going to see that this variance property shows up in the instances as well. And so I'm going to just change a couple of more details here to make them a little bit more distinct. This is still going to say Berkeley CA, but this is how I made a variant. If I wanted to add an additional variant, I select the entire thing that says card, and then I press this plus button that appears when I hover. And it's going to do the same thing. It'll make an identical copy of the first one that I can again change in any way. So if I wanted to make this say sunny, and I want to grab the sun icon right here, you kind of get the idea. I can basically make these copies really quickly. I can make them very easily. And I'll show why that's important in just a second. Cool. So now I have these three versions. They're card. If you look in the panels over here, you see that one of them is called sunny, one of them is called rainy, one of them is called cloudy, and you'll see that the diamond again is different. The filled singular diamond is used for different variants of the same component, and they're all stored under this main component that's called card with the fancier diamond. Any instance of any of these three is going to have this diamond. So what I'm going to do is drag out cloudy, and now I've got one cloudy instance with me right here. You'll see that it's still called card, but that it's unfilled and it has the same properties as before, where it doesn't show the name of it in the top left corner. Now, if I click here, this is the fun part. If I click here, it's going to change what it actually is. So it's going to let me switch between the different variants really easily and really quickly. This is very helpful when you're doing any kind of UI work, because you're going to be needing to do this quite often. You can have everything placed in a way that you want, and then you can change kind of the version or the variant that you're going to be using. And the overrides do still apply in this sense. So if I go ahead and change this color to be a little bit lighter, you're going to see it reflected here as well. But then if I change this back into being the rainy version, it's still going to change the icon. So the variants are not treated necessarily exactly like overrides. They're just different versions of the same component. If I change back to sunny, you see it's preserved my override from here. Or not my override, the changes from the main component. If I actually change this to be a different number though, when I change it to a different variant, it has fundamentally become a different component, and so that override is not there anymore. So that is something to be cognizant of. I will say I think Figma can be a little bit glitchy in this sense, so I'd just be careful with any kind of overrides that you make to make sure that they're still maintained. Yeah, so if you're making variants, I would strongly recommend you actually do the method I just showed you. This actually did not exist at the time of making this demo. It is a pretty recent update, which is why it's not reflected here. This, however, what is described here is also a valid version. And I'll show you kind of a quick version of that. So if I have three squares and I make this one red, I make this one yellow, and I make the last one blue, I can really quickly make these three into variants of the same component because Figma has like a clever naming scheme thing. So I'm going to go ahead and name this square/red. I'm going to name this square/yellow, and I'm going to name this square/blue. If I select all three of these, I can go ahead and immediately turn these into variants. So I can click here and say create component set, And what that's going to do is going to make all of these square component with variants blue, yellow, and red. So that slash naming scheme is going to be really helpful in the future if you ever need to do, for whatever reason, something like what I just did, and say you need to make like a checkerboard or something. You're going to be able to do that really, really easily. Any questions about those things? Mm-hmm.
How do you make a component a regular object?
How do you make a component a regular object? A main component or an instance? Yeah, so both. So for the instance, it's relatively easy. I'm going to pull out this instance of a red square. I just right click and say Detach Instance. So the words attach is going to be what's there. As a side note, if you're at a company and you're working in their design system, you should basically almost never do this. People get really freaking mad when you detach instances. It's like a design systems thing. People who are in charge of the design systems will hunt you down and be mad at you. But if you're just working in your own file, it's fine. Sometimes you need to do that. It's a little bit more complicated for the entire component because there is not really a way to make this not a component anymore. If I have come in a case where I have accidentally made something a component and I need it to not be anymore, I will do one of two things. First is I will Command Z until it's gone, and I've reverted whatever it is I just did. Or, assuming there are no instances that I need to worry about, I would just take an instance of each, copy them out, detach them, and then delete this. That's what I would do. I think that's the easiest way, but there really isn't a way to unmake a component that I am aware of. It's possible it exists and I've just never heard of it. But yeah, basically make a copy and delete the original. Deleting that original is not going to actually delete all of the components. Like if I delete this, it's not going to magically make these disappear. But it will be a little bit confusing because it says this is still a component. It's still an instance, but its parent is gone. So if I go here, if you're on any instance, you can actually right click and say to go to the main component. So this is actually going to say restore main component because I've accidentally deleted it. So I can bring it back to life basically. But normally if I just kind of drag this out, I make a copy of this. I'm going to actually cut that and paste it over here in a completely different page. I just put it over here. If I right click this and say go to main component, it'll bring me there, which is really convenient. I think Figma is actually smart enough to do this across files as well. So if you're working in a large design system where you're using a library, you should be able to do that. It should be able to bring you back to the main component wherever the source of truth is. And then I can actually return to the instance as well so I don't get interrupted in my workflow. You might have seen when I did that, there's also an option to say push overrides to master. The push stuff getting very into like Git territory for CS people. But if I were to change this, say I'm working in this file and I've decided really late in the process I actually want these suns to be bright red, what I can do is right click this and say push overrides, and then the main component is now going to actually be updated to change that. This is just really helpful in case you just don't feel like going all the way back to the main component. And this will also, as you see, push that override to all of the instances as well. Now, is there anything I missed here? Yeah, there's an opportunity to change variant. There's also an option to reset all the overrides. So this is a case where I can see that here. If I do this here, I can reset all the overrides as well. Cool. All right, any other questions about components here? Really quick, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of these two files that I would really encourage you to check out if you want to get a better sense of how components work. This is the Material 2 design kit. Again, Material Design is what Google uses for all of its kind of apps and products, so you might be familiar with how it looks. You see that in this file, they've actually named it sticker sheet and components. So the sticker sheet is going to be things that you can drag and drop really easily. But this is an example of what you might make a component out of. So the answer is basically everything. You've got these app bars that they use in all the tops of their apps. They have the navigation bars, backdrops. They have this sticker sheet of just all sorts of things that you can use all the time. And in the components file, you'll see all of these different things as well. I actually think that they didn't really leverage variants in this file because it is like a relatively new update to Figma, but you would have the opportunity to say combine them as variants. So if I were to do that, I have these component 1. These are not named in the way that we described earlier, but because of the way they're named, you can kind of see how they might implement them as variants. Sorry, it's kind of disappeared. But examples of stuff that you might make components out of: navigation bars, buttons, these kind of creating new elements, I guess. Buttons, cards, chips, dialogues, all sorts of things exist here. The same goes for this kit as well. Here they do actually use variants. So again, going back to this example, all of these are alerts. You know that all of these things are going to be used in kind of the same context. All of them are alerts. There's the same properties, but there's different versions of it. 1 action, 2 actions, 2 actions vertical, 3 actions, dark version. And so that's why they've combined them all under the family or umbrella of alerts, but with different variants on them. This is a great file to kind of look through. I'm not going to have time to go through all of it, but I think this is a good place to pause really quick and take a 3-minute break. Sorry, I know it's short. We do have quite a lot of content to go through today, but we'll reconvene at around 6:54. Also, any other questions? Okay, it is 1:54, so we're going to go ahead and get started again. There's quite a lot of content to kind of get through for the rest of today, but again, I know components are a pretty difficult concept to kind of grok over, so if you ever have any questions, especially going into the homework this week and going into the lab this week, please don't hesitate to reach out. Please message Slack, message me, message your TA. Happy to walk you through anything. Come to office hours. We know that it's kind of tricky to kind of pick up immediately. For some context, this week's homework is going to be to make Spotify based on like kind of what you see, and you can kind of think about what elements of Spotify might be components, which we'll talk about in the homework as well. But hopefully that kind of digital or like tangible example will help you kind of grok your understanding of this. So with that said, we're going to move on to a couple of other small useful tools that we kind of use all the time when we're making anything in Figma. The first is smart selection. So you might have seen this before, I might have mentioned it, but when you're working in Figma, it's guaranteed you're going to constantly have layers, elements, shapes, all these kinds of things that you have to rearrange. And smart selection lets you do that by selecting a group of items and then spacing them out to be consistent, or reordering them really easily. And so the only thing you have to do is select several objects, make sure that they're evenly spaced, and then you can drag out these kind of pink handles and pink bars that will appear once they're adequately spaced. And you can change the spacing. You can change all of the kind of order of these things. If you want to swap the order of objects that have already been tidied up or aligned, you can grab them, and then this pink handle in the middle, which you can't see super well here, will appear, and you can reorder them. And I do use this all the time for slides. I use this all the time when I'm organizing stuff. It is a very helpful, very small like quality of life thing that you use all the time. And on top of that, Figma has this tidy up feature that will take any set of objects that you've selected and make the spacing a lot nicer. It'll make them all evenly spaced. If it's in a grid, it'll make them spaced both ways really consistently. Definitely leverage this anytime you select a lot of objects. You can actually also resize multiple objects at once. You can select the middle of the handle. It's a little bit hard to see here, and then resize the ones that you have selected. But it's a lot easier if I just show you. So going here, let's take a look at these three squares. I can select all three of them, and because these are already evenly spaced, because I did that earlier, you can see that it's the spacing icon right here with kind of the two edges and the line in between. I can either change this manually, I can make them 80 pixels apart, I can make them 2 pixels apart, or what I can do is zoom in until I see this pink handle. It might be a little bit hard to see on the screen, but a pink handle appears and turns the cursor into these two arrows. I can click and drag, and it's going to tell me how far apart they are as I go. So I can do that. I can also reorder them. You see these pink handles appear. I can drag the yellow one here. I can drag the red one here. And even if I kind of go out of the way, it's going to tell me with this blue box where it's going to land once I let go. It's not going to actually let me put it all the way over here. So if I let go here, it snaps it right into place, which is very convenient. That resizing property, it's going to be a little hard to show you. I don't know how well you can see it, but if I select this pink handle and this pink handle, I can then actually just resize those two elements. Oh, no you can't. This actually might have been something that Figma got rid of. But if I select these two, yeah, okay, I guess you can't. Dang, never mind then. Oh, there you go. I just select them holding Control or Command. So if I click on the yellow one and then I click on the blue one while holding Shift, it'll select all three. And then I can resize all three. If I then deselect the yellow one by pressing it with Command, okay. The point is you're able to do this. I'm sorry about that. I think it's kind of finicky. I don't think that you're going to use that nearly as much as the other two properties here of the spacing and the ordering, but do keep it in mind if you ever need it. Just to show you as well, this goes for two directions. So if I have them even like a little bit offset, what I can do here, you'll see that the pink handles don't show up, but this icon does. It's the tidy up icon, which you can also see here. If I click it, it's going to snap them into a grid, however Figma thinks is the best, and then I can reset, kind of reorder these however I want. I can drag these around as well, and it's going to decide for me what kind of axis this is on. Sometimes it'll do it by vertical axes, sometimes it'll do it by horizontal axes. It's kind of luck of the draw, but you can sometimes manipulate it with the way that you set up the spacing. Grids and guides are going to be really helpful for anything you need to be really pixel perfect. Another example of this is, again, slide decks, where I really want the spacing to always be consistent. So grids and guides are two separate tools that you can use to align objects and keep spacing in mind. Guides are kind of similar to the guides that you see in Google Slides. You can drag them out to where you want to align things, and then layout grids are these kind of like plaid or gingham looking stripes that help you within one particular frame, and that's not reliant on a pixel grid. It's more math based. Cool. So again, guides, basically you can drag out a singular line and then lock that into place so that it is always there whenever you have them on. And then the same way that objects snap to each other, the same way that you can have, like we talked about earlier, that alignment or distance from different things, it'll treat the guide like that too. So you'll be able to easily snap things to the edge of the guide or align things with the guide or see how far away things are from the guide as well. In order to do this, you want to make sure that the rulers are on. So we're going to go ahead and show you an example here. Let's just make a frame. To make sure that the rulers are on, you can do a couple of things. The easiest is just to do Command question mark and Control question mark and type rulers and show rulers. It's Shift R. And these are going to appear now. These are based in pixels right now. And what I can do is just drag something out from here. And if you see up at the very, very top, it says 66, it goes up to 83. That's going to tell me how many pixels away it is from the edge of this frame. So if I don't have it inside the frame, it can tell me just this hard code of the negative 897th pixel on this entire canvas. But if I'm within the frame, it's going to tell me in context. So let's make this 24 pixels away. And then let's have one also 24 pixels from the top. These guides are now going to be let me snap things into them. So if I wanted to make a rectangle and put it in a corner that's 24 pixels away from both, I can snap it in really easily right here. I guess it's hard to tell, but like I can feel it kind of snapping in. And if you look at the ruler on the top as well, it tells me exactly how many pixels away I am from each side and the width of it. So that is how guides work. Grids, on the other hand, are maybe a little bit more complicated, but they tell you things like how many columns you have, so it's more math-based. You can say, I want 6 columns that are equidistant and have 12 pixels in between them. It'll do all the math of dividing out like the whole width of the frame for you without you having to worry about it. You can apply layout grids only to frames. You can't do them across the entire canvas like we just saw with the grids, where like I can do a guide here that's just straight up like in the middle of the file and will be there no matter how far down I scroll. But with a grid, you can't do that across the entire file. It must be within a particular frame. There are a couple kinds. In order to apply any of them, you select the frame. You apply the grid in the right sidebar under the words layout grid, and then by default it'll make a 10 by 10 pixel kind of like grid paper-esque grid, but then I can modify them to be more custom, to be whatever it is that I need. There are 3 kinds. The first is the standard grid paper grid, and then you have columns and rows. Columns and rows are probably what you're going to use more often, and you can see here that there's 2 ways that you can apply them, where this one is more dynamic. If you look here, if I've taken this and I've kind of dragged the frame out to be really wide, it's dragged the columns out too. But on the left side, I've taken this and I've dragged the frame out to be really wide, but the columns have stayed where they are. And these are kind of different properties of each particular kind of grid. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that now. We'll go into frame 2, and I'm going to actually just turn off the guides. Or actually, I guess I'll delete the guide by pulling it back into the ruler. That should work. Yeah. When you pull it back into the ruler, it actually goes away. But here, I'm going to add a layout grid. If I click this, again, 10 pixel by 10 pixel default grid, if I go ahead and change this to, say, columns, it'll just make those columns for me. And then this is that idea of where it is when you kind of reshape the frame. So with stretch, you're going to see that if I take the frame and I stretch it out, it's going to make the columns themselves stretch out as well. If I want to have these be in the center and I want their width to always be 30, then when I stretch it out, it's going to stay centered, but they're always going to be 30 pixels thick. And if I make this to the right, I want to have it offset, say, 50 pixels. It's always going to have them, again, kind of locked to the right side. You might just want to play around with this a little bit. I'm going to turn the light on again. Awesome. Hopefully these turn back on. Great. Awesome. I'm going to email them about that. But this idea of grids and guides is basically just a way to make things that are on your frame more easily aligned. So if I go ahead and grab this, you can see it's going to lock to these different parts of the grid that are going to be really convenient for me whenever I need them. Something else to take note of is like a more tangible example here. We actually do have guides on for all of these slide decks. This is because there's a lot of components that we always have to realign all the time. And so we want to make sure that things are locked in. This kind of 12 column system is very common across people who make slide decks, and Miles taught the slide deck design decal, and he made our slides, so he's very into all of this. But this kind of micro alignment is probably overkill sometimes, but it is helpful in creating like normal visual rhythm that we'll talk about a little bit later with spacing. Any questions about grids and guides? Cool. Constraints are kind of the last of these kind of handy tools that we'll talk about today. So what happens to content when we resize it? You might have seen this if you've ever tried to like resize your trading card, for example. When you make the frame a different size, sometimes it goes all wonky, but you have a lot of control over that with this idea of constraints. So in this example on the right, you can see that most of the stuff kind of stays aligned to the top left, but this particular logo just keeps moving around when we resize it, but we want it to stay in the top left corner. And so if we do this, when we mess with the constraints in the way that we want, you're going to see that now this stays. We have control over that. We can decide what goes where whenever you resize things. And something that's also really handy is that you can always hold Control or Command when resizing to just ignore every constraint, which can be really helpful in particular cases. So just keep that in mind. If you need to ignore constraints, if you want nothing to be moving around when you resize something, hold Control or Command. And so the constraint options are relatively simple. There's the horizontal axis and the vertical axis. And whatever you block it to, it's going to stay that far away from wherever it is. So if I say it's aligned to the left and the top, that particular object is going to care a lot about the top left corner. It says, I am currently 12 pixels away from the top and 45 pixels away from the right. I am always going to stay that far, even if this corner shifts up, even if it goes down, even if I resize it. If the left corner cares, I do not care. I do not care if that bottom right corner moves, but if this corner moves, I care. If I have it set to the right and the bottom, the same applies, where the right bottom corner is the one that matters. The object is here, it's always going to stay that far away from the right bottom. If I move the top left, that object doesn't care, it just needs to stay the same distance away. Now left and right and top and bottom are going to be a little bit different. It's a little hard to articulate exactly why they're different from centering. But basically, centering is always going to be the same distance from the left and the right, whereas if I say left and right, if I'm 10 pixels away from the right, and I'm right here, if I'm 45 pixels away from the left, I'll always stay that particular distance away. So even if I kind of drag it out, it'll keep that ratio the same, but it won't be centered. Center means it's going to be in the middle. It's always going to stay in the middle. But left and right means it needs to stay proportionately the same distance from both sides. Scale is also probably the most interesting one, which says that if it grows in size, I will also grow. So the object, if it's this big and it's kind of the square around me, if I make the square a lot bigger, the object itself is also going to get bigger. Kind of like the hole in a donut. If you have a bigger donut, the hole is also bigger, which doesn't make a lot of sense. My physics teacher explained this to me. But we can talk about constraints here in this example. So what I'm going to do is just make a square frame. And in the middle of it, I'm going to put a rectangle, and we're going to mess with the constraints of this thing. So if I put it here and I say left and top, which is what it's generally defaulting to, then you'll see if I move the right bottom, it does not care, it does not move, but if I move the top left, it's going to stay with it. It's going to go wherever that corner goes. It's going to stay the same distance forever. If I say move this here, and I change it to, let's say, the right top, it's always going to care about this corner, but nothing else. So if I move this one and it doesn't move, if I move this one and change the right, it's going to move with it as well. Moving this up and down is not actually going to affect it in any way, but moving it left and right does. Now that idea earlier that we talked about of left and right and top and bottom, you're going to be able to see how it stays consistently kind of scaling with the left and the right. It always wants to be what is this? 337 away from the left and 1,013 from the right, so it's going to resize as it goes. To always maintain that. But if I have this set to center, oh, I actually explained this wrong. I'm so sorry. When I have it set to center, it's going to keep that ratio the same, but the object itself is going to stay the same size. So keep that in mind, where left and right, or top and bottom, means that it can resize, whereas center means it won't resize. And then if I have it set to scale, it'll do probably what you expect, where it's going to scale. I've set it to both directions, and it's kind of the most dynamic of the bunch. Cool. Any questions about constraints? Cool. And that last thing that I talked about earlier, to ignore constraints, I can resize this while holding control. And it's going to just leave it there in this kind of void without changing the size, changing the location of it in any way. It's probably going to come in handy with things like illustration later on down the line. Cool. All right. We have quite a few more topics to go through today. It is possible I won't necessarily finish today, but we'll try to get through as much as we can. This next piece is about composition and spacing. This idea of like how to actually place things on your file or on your designs is pretty important. It's pretty critical to any kind of design discipline. So visual hierarchy is important in our designs to kind of let the audience or user know what is important, what they should be focusing on. So normally when you're designing something, you personally know in your head, this is the most important part. If you're showing it to somebody, you might tell them like, oh, can I get feedback on the illustration here? Can I get feedback on this thing? But when your users are looking at your work, they're not going to have somebody with them to tell them, hey, this is what you should be looking at, this is what you should be clicking on. That should be obvious, it should be intuitive, based on just looking at your interface. And so the newspaper is a great example of something that takes visual hierarchy very seriously. We talked about this last week with typography. But this headline, this level 1, is going to be the thing that you look at first, followed by the subhead and probably the image, and then followed very last by the text, the very smallest stuff on the screen. And so that's kind of the basic idea of visual hierarchy. The bigger something is, the bolder something is, the more the user's eye is going to be drawn to it. So by establishing focal points, we can present designs with the right amount of priority and communicate purpose through just looking at something. So there's a couple different ways to create visual hierarchy. There's a lot of them. The first is color. Anything that we talked about last week with color. If you have an accent on a mostly black and white screen, you're going to be drawn towards that color. If you use colors as a way to guide the user, you're going to always be able to rely on that particular color throughout as well. This example of the Apple kind of interface on like all of their different products, this is how your eye generally moves to the screen. You're going to be looking up at the top of all of these different icons, moving to the center to see the title, and then kind of moving reading order left to right on the bottom. And something to keep in mind as well is the idea of reading order and how that applies in like Western languages and English language, where we read from left to right, top to bottom. That doesn't always apply, but it does mean that a lot of things that are made for Western use are going to follow similar visual hierarchy, where you kind of start up here and then you move down here. But the Gestalt principles are another kind of way to use psychology to figure out how a user might approach a screen. So this is basically a set of different principles that you can utilize. Not necessarily always in UI design. You can use this as well in graphic design, any kind of illustration, if you're doing any kind of marketing. That is basically observing the way that our brain understands different things. And so like an example here is that like this is not really a drawing of a Dalmatian, but you might see a Dalmatian in it. People love to talk about like negative space and fun logos, like the FedEx logo has an arrow in it. That's an example of negative space. That is a Gestalt principle. So we'll talk through a couple of these really quickly. If you are more interested in learning more about these, I would recommend you revisit these slides. I'm going to be moving a little bit fast so we can get through this section today. But the first is proximity. This idea is that elements that are closer together are perceived to be related to each other in some way. And so like when I'm looking at this classroom, my brain would immediately think that the people who are clumped in that corner know each other, because if you know each other, you're probably sitting next to each other. Proximity is a pretty logical step that your brain would take. Common region is similar as well, where elements in the same region can be perceived as grouped, but you can also kind of think about it the other way, where things that are in different regions might be separated for whatever reason to emphasize that they are different. Similarity as well, if you look at this set, in this example, you probably perceive each column as a group rather than each row as a group. Even with the use of color, you would perceive these 6 as maybe something that are related instead of these 4. So this is an example where there are 2 principles that are applied, both the idea of common region or proximity, but also similarity. And your brain kind of takes precedence. Your brain decides which one takes greater precedence, which in a way that is probably different based on culture and based on upbringing, but we won't get into all of that quite well immediately. But the idea with similarity, stuff that looks similar, whether it's color, shape, size, texture, your brain is going to think they're related, and they probably are. Closure is that idea of negative space that we talked about earlier. These kind of fun illustrations a lot of the time will use the sense of closure, where your brain kind of fills in the gaps. Now, continuation is also similar, where you'll see this kind of more with illustration as well. But in this case, even though these are colored in the way that they are, you're probably sensing that this is a straight line with a curvy line going through it, instead of one line that's like a weird L and the other line is also a weird L. In this example as well, you probably see it more as an X as opposed to 2 kind of these shapes on top of each other. And then even though these are 2 different colors, you're probably seeing it as one line rather than 2. That was a really fast overview of Gestalt principles. You can get all into the psychology of these if you're interested. But for the time being, this is all we're going to kind of cover. The next thing is spatial and grid systems. I think this is extremely, extremely important. So if you've been like zoning out or anything, I totally understand, but I do want to make sure this gets drilled in. This idea of spatial systems and grid systems is very important if you're doing any kind of UI, because it draws into this idea of visual rhythm and consistency. So if your apps were made in kind of this way, where nothing really, there's no pattern, everything is a different width, everything is a different height, everything is a different amount apart from each other, there's going to be a sense of discomfort or dissonance whenever you're using it, because it's not predictable. Humans like stuff that is predictable. And so as a result, using these kind of grid systems or using these spatial systems kind of elevates your design to another level, and basically helps you set rules for the way that you measure, size, and space all of your elements. So going back to this slide, an 8 or 6 point spatial system is generally very, very common, mostly the 8 and 12 point, These multiples are very helpful because they're very divisible. You can have tons of different sizes within them that still fall within that particular system. But this idea here of how a design without a system can feel untrustworthy or off is really important. And I really want you all to think about this. I know it is very, very neurotic for me to say to be pixel perfect all the time, and you don't have to be all the time, but thinking about the spacing is going to be really helpful in making things that just feel a little bit better. And again, defining spatial systems, anything from 4 to 10 is generally common. Don't use prime numbers. 3 and 5 and 7 are probably not your best bets. 4 or 8 or maybe 12 point are the most consistent. And I won't get into this too much, but this is very helpful with doing things like CSS, doing things like any kind of front end or coding that is involved with kind of your design work. And so these are examples here where this whole column has a 40 point height and 8 pixel padding. That consistency creates rhythm. It creates predictability in your designs in a way that is going to be more comfortable to use. And when you decide what kind of increment to use, like a lot of the time I space things up by 24, 12, 48 pixels. That's a lot of more intuition. Do you want a lot of space in your interface? Do you want a lot of space and negative, like room to breathe in your designs, or do you want things to be tight fit? One example is Gmail. When Gmail has the compact version versus the cozy version versus the default version of how like thinly spaced everything is. I like seeing a lot of emails, but it like panics me to see so many really close together, which is why I don't use the compact version. And that's a case where you want the user to decide what the spacing is going to look like, or you want the user to decide, how much they want to be able to see on their screen. Cool. This is another case where grids are going to be really helpful. Column grids and modular grids are going to be ways to actually implement what we've just talked about. So a column grid here lets you organize content into vertical columns really easily, and then you can actually go against the edges of the grid, while a modular grid here lets you use rows and columns to define a matrix. There are a lot of grid systems that you can get into. I think Figma has a good grasp on basic grid systems. I don't think you'll have to get further than this in this class, but they're all built on the same idea of rows and columns to define padding, spacing, margins, whatever you want to call it, just the distance between objects. Cool. Any questions about spacing and composition? I know they've kind of run through that really quickly. Cool. If you are interested in composition, we're also going to be talking about it much later in week 9 when we talk about illustration, which is going to be a different kind of composition. It's more about the art form rather than necessarily practicality. But with this, I know that I went through it quite quickly, and I just want to highlight a couple of things. Once again, let me turn off these grids. So from what I just talked about, which I know that I did very fast, I really want to highlight this idea of visual hierarchy. First of all, this idea of, where does your eye go first? And this is a really easy one to test with. All you have to do is close the tab, look away for 5 minutes, and then look at it again. And whatever your eye goes to first, that's probably what the user's eye is also going to go towards. So whenever you're designing any kind of project, doing this kind of look away test is going to be really helpful in figuring out, hey, does my visual hierarchy make sense at all here? With the Gestalt principles, I would encourage you to think about this idea of proximity and this idea of common regions. Putting things close together is going to make people think they're related. That's kind of the goal of this. And then trusting your own intuition on what you think feels right is more important than necessarily strictly following these principles. Remember that these are principles that people have designed as a way to understand how humans think, not the other way around. It's not learning this and then deciding how you're going to react to something. It's using these as a framework to understand how other people are going to react. And then once again, I just really want you all to think about these grid systems, to really adhere, especially when you're just starting out, to these kind of 8, 16, 12-point pixel systems. They're going to be really helpful in making consistency later on. You're going to see that even phone screen dimensions are going to follow that kind of thing as well. Cool. Now, jumping into this last bit, this concept of ideation and wireframing, we'll do a review of this at the beginning of next week, because I'm just going to blast through this right now. But this is kind of what the beginning of the design process looks like. And so when you start out, when you're designing things initially, you don't want to go straight into that final, polished, beautiful version of whatever you're making. It's going to look scrappy. It's going to look very bare bones, and that's important, and that is okay. So what is this term wireframing, and why is it important? Something to note is that this is also frequently called prototyping. If you've ever taken an engineering class, this idea of building out a prototype is kind of that first pass at something. We're not going to use the word prototyping because that means something else in Figma, but it's the same idea. So wireframing, it's called that because it's kind of the skeleton. You're building out the bare bones of whatever it is that you're creating, because you might have to try out different ideas. You might have to have a bunch of different layouts. You might have 17 different solutions to the one problem that you've been presented. There is not all the time in the world always to make every single one of those beautiful and colored and have gradients and have shadows and bevels. There's not time for that. And so what you want to do is wireframe those. You want to have them be as clear and concise as possible while still expressing what your solution looks like. So wireframing is a really good way to work through all of those different ideas and even prompt new ones as you're doing them. So experimentation here, this is an example of, say, an app that is for reading. So wireframes are basically kind of your design at the earliest stages of the process. Fidelity, which you might have heard before, high fidelity, low fidelity, mid fidelity, generally refers to kind of the level of quality. If you've heard the term lo-fi and lo-fi music, it's the same idea. It's music that's generally produced at a lower sound quality, which is why it can have that kind of scratchy sound to it. Fidelity is basically the kind of level of quality that you're at the moment, which is the next slide. So you can think of fidelity as completeness. This is an example of a website at low or mid fidelity and high fidelity. You can see here that in high fidelity, they've applied all the perfect fonts. They've found everything that they've needed. They've made this kind of visual identity and this visual system. The image is replaced. There's color now. The spacing is quite perfected. Whereas in the low and the mid-fi version, it is not that this is worse, because you can pretty clearly tell how they got from here to here. You get the entire sense of how they've laid everything out and how they've established the visual hierarchy. So even in this pretty small screenshot, you can see this is the headline. This is what your eye should be going towards first. This is the image to look at next. And even within here, it's a little bit small in the screenshot, but you have slightly larger headline text with smaller subtitle text below. And then the way that all of these different scents, this is like a lotion brand or something like that, are structured, it shows up in even this very low fidelity version. And when you look at this, this probably doesn't take too long to build out, whereas this takes quite a lot of iteration to get to these final decisions. So low fidelity, as you might expect, is starting from the beginning or at the very bottom of this kind of pyramid. And I say pyramid because you're probably going to have the most low fidelity work. As you go to mid fidelity, you've decided more things, you've made those key decisions, and you have things maybe with like text, with color, just a little bit more information to get you there. But you've narrowed it down. You don't have all of the 17 ideas that you came up with in low fidelity. You've narrowed it to maybe your top 2, your maybe top 3, something that you are willing to work on a little bit more. And when you get to the top of the pyramid, this idea of high fidelity, that's really close to your final product. That is adding the color, that's adding the text, that's adding the fonts. It has all of the things that are brought in and perfected with content as close as possible to what you actually want to make. And so this is another example of one screen in low, mid, and high fidelity. And what's not shown here is that idea of iteration, of making a lot of different versions of this low fidelity screen. You know, pumping out as many ideas as you can is a really like common strategy whenever you start working on something. Just getting all of those ideas out on paper, whether you like to use like physical pen and paper, if you like to be on a whiteboard, if you like to use FigJam, there's tons of different things that you can do here. But you can see what changes in between each. In this example, low fidelity is like probably an iPad drawing. Mid fidelity, they've gone into Figma and they've made all of the shapes, they've put all the text pieces down, and the final, in the high fidelity, the logo exists, the image exists, the actual text that's going to be used in the app exists. All of the bevels are there, the corners are routed, the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and everything is kind of there. But in this low fidelity, you see that you've already understood the hierarchy and you've already understood the basic shapes going into this final product. Something else to think about is that the line between these three things can be pretty blurry. It is very much up to personal expectation. One person's low fidelity could be somebody else's mid fidelity. One person's mid fidelity could be somebody else's high fidelity. Those words are just there to guide you and kind of think about, mentally, where do I think I am in the process and how much work should I be putting into each of these pieces. So when you want to move to mid or high fidelity, generally the things that you would see are adding text, adding, bevels, the things that I've mentioned before. But it's important to just understand that everyone's design process looks a little bit different, and understanding what yours looks like is very important. Any questions about anything regarding kind of low, mid, high fidelity or wireframing? Cool. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. I've mentioned earlier that the homework this week is making Spotify. I am very excited about this homework. I think it's a lot of fun. It's going to kind of walk you through that low, mid, and high fidelity process as well, where you get to kind of look at, how would you conceptualize the visual hierarchy of Spotify? Where would you put these boxes of like all of the playlists or all of the profiles or all of the friend activity? That's something that you get to decide by reverse engineering something that's already in high fidelity. You'll also be working with components and getting a chance to make your own, kind of understand how variants might be applied based on things that you're already familiar with. The lab is going to go much more deeply into variants. Your TAs will have a lot of hands-on time with you to figure out exactly how to navigate this idea of variants and components. But yeah, today's secret word is going to be rainy, R-A-I-N-Y, for the weather component that we made earlier. And the form should still be at that link. Cool. The only announcements that we have this week are just to do the homework, the lab, and the readings. Make sure that you are also doing the readings. I know that this can sometimes fall between the cracks, but do let us know if you have any questions about any of this. And please feel free to come to office hours this week. We're more than happy to work with you on anything that was confusing. But yeah, thank you so much. I know today's pacing might have been a little bit weird with how much time we spent on components, but I hope you have a lovely week, and I will see you next Tuesday. Thank you.